You think Princess Diana was just a beautiful woman who married into royalty? Think again. Diana Spencer carried more royal English blood in her veins than her husband Prince Charles ever did. While the Windsors were German imports who changed their name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor in 1917 to avoid anti-German sentiment during World War I, Diana descended from the actual Tudor and Stuart dynasties that built the British Empire. But here's what nobody tells you about royal blood. It's not a blessing. It's a generational curse that transforms women into breeding animals and political currency. When genealogists traced Diana's ancestry, they found something remarkable. She descended from King Charles II through multiple lines, from King James II, and most significantly, from Margaret Tudor, the sister of the infamous Henry VIII. Through her father John Spencer, 8th Earl Spencer, Diana carried the bloodline of at least a dozen English and Scottish monarchs. The Spencer family had been closely allied with the royal family for several generations, which is historian speak for they've been part of the royal breeding program for centuries. Charles, on the other hand, came from the House of Hanover, German nobility invited to rule England in 1714, specifically because the actual English royal lines had died out. The Windsors are essentially professional imported royalty. Diana was the real deal, descended from the people who actually built the British throne. But this advantage came with a price that had been accumulating interest for over 500 years. Because royal blood doesn't mean power or privilege for women. It means your body belongs to the state. It means your fertility is a national resource. It means you're not a person, you're a transaction. The Spencer family understood this perfectly. They'd watched for generations as their royal-blooded daughters were married off to secure alliances, produce heirs, and then discarded when they'd served their purpose. Diana's ancestors included women who'd been sold at 13, widowed violently, divorced publicly, and died young after being used up by the system. Every drop of royal blood in Diana's veins came with a story of trauma. And the truly horrific part? The system that destroyed those women was still operating in 1981 when 19-year-old Diana Spencer walked down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral, watched by 750 million people worldwide. Because when you have royal blood, you don't get to choose your own life. The bloodline chooses for you. And it all started with one woman who was sacrificed at the altar of political ambition over 480 years before Diana was born. A woman whose name was also chosen carefully for political reasons. A woman who thought marriage to a king would be her fairy tale, only to discover she'd been sold into a nightmare that would echo through her descendants for half a millennium. Her name was Margaret Tudor, and she was Henry VIII's older sister, the one he used as a political bargaining chip when she was barely old enough to understand what marriage meant. Margaret Tudor was born on November 28, 1489, at Westminster Palace, the eldest surviving daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But don't let the word princess fool you. In the Tudor court, being a royal daughter meant being inventory. Valuable inventory, sure, but still just a commodity waiting to be traded for the right political advantage. Her father, Henry VII, had a problem. He'd won his crown by killing the previous king at the Battle of Bosworth Field, which meant his claim to the throne was shaky at best. He couldn't play the divine right of kings card when everyone knew he'd literally murdered his way to power. His solution? Make alliances through marriage, and his most valuable bargaining chip was his eldest daughter. When Margaret was just 7 years old, negotiations began for her future. Not her education, not her interests, not what she wanted to be when she grew up. Her future as someone else's property. The target was Scotland, England's longtime enemy to the north. For centuries, the Scots had been sending raiders and supporting pretenders to the English throne. Henry VII needed to stop the bleeding, and he decided his 7-year-old daughter was the perfect band-aid. The negotiations took years because they were discussing a business merger, not a marriage. What lands would come with Margaret? What political promises? What happened if she failed to produce heirs? What if she died in childbirth? Every detail was hammered out by men in rooms Margaret never entered, deciding the fate of a girl who was still playing with dolls. In 1502, when Margaret was 12 years old, the Treaty of Perpetual Peace was signed. The name is darkly ironic, given that it would barely outlast Henry VII's lifetime, but the important clause was this: Margaret Tudor, aged 12, would marry James IV of Scotland, aged 29. A child would be sent north to marry a man old enough to be her father, to cement a peace treaty between countries that had been murdering each other for generations. Margaret was married by proxy in January 1503, when she was still 13. She hadn't even met James IV yet, but she was legally his wife. The actual ceremony, where she physically met her husband for the first time, took place in August 1503 at Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh. Margaret was 13 years old, dressed in elaborate finery, performing in a ceremony she barely understood, binding herself to a stranger for the rest of her life. By the standards of the time, this wasn't unusual. Royal daughters were routinely married at 13 or 14 to men decades older. The church technically required girls to be at least 12 to marry, though consummation was supposed to wait until 14. Whether James IV waited those few months is unclear from historical records, but given the political pressure to produce heirs quickly, it's unlikely he showed much restraint. For the first few years, Margaret's marriage wasn't the complete disaster it could have been. James IV was, by the standards of Scottish kings, relatively decent. He was educated, cultured, spoke multiple languages, and genuinely seemed to try to make Margaret comfortable in her new kingdom. They had 6 children together, though only one, James Fees, would survive to adulthood. The others died in infancy or early childhood, each death another reminder that even royal babies died at horrifying rates in the early 1500s. But here's where Margaret's story takes its first truly dark turn. In 1509, Margaret's father Henry VII died, and her younger brother became King Henry VIII. The young, ambitious Henry VIII had zero interest in his father's careful diplomacy. He wanted glory, conquest, and war with France. The problem? Scotland had a 200-year-old alliance with France called the Old Alliance, which essentially meant if England attacked France, Scotland had to attack England. Margaret found herself caught between her birth family and her married family. She begged her husband not to honor the alliance, not to attack her brother's kingdom. James IV ignored her pleas. In September 1513, James IV led a Scottish army across the border into England while Henry VIII was fighting in France. The result was the Battle of Flodden, one of the bloodiest battles in British history. James IV was killed at Flodden, along with much of Scotland's nobility. Margaret Tudor, at 23 years old, was suddenly a widow. Her husband's body was so mutilated in the battle that identification was difficult. Scotland was left in chaos, with a 1-year-old king, Margaret's son James V, and a kingdom full of men who didn't trust the English-born queen. Here's what you need to understand. Margaret didn't just lose her husband. She lost whatever protection and status marriage had given her. Under James IV's will, she was named Regent of Scotland for her infant son, but only as long as she remained unmarried. The moment she remarried, she'd lose all political power. Margaret tried to rule Scotland for a year. It was a disaster. She was a woman in a position of supreme power in an era when women were considered incapable of ruling. She was the sister of England's king, which made every Scottish lord suspect her of being an English agent. Pro-French factions immediately started working to replace her with John Stuart, Duke of Albany, the closest male relative to the infant king. In August 1514, barely a year after becoming regent, Margaret made the catastrophic decision to remarry. Her new husband was Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, a Scottish noble she'd apparently fallen for. The marriage was politically idiotic. By marrying, she forfeited her regency. The Scottish Parliament immediately declared her unfit to continue as regent and invited the Duke of Albany to take over. But it gets worse. Angus turned out to be a disaster of a husband. He was more interested in power than in Margaret, and their marriage quickly deteriorated into mutual hatred. Meanwhile, Albany arrived in Scotland in 1515 and took custody of Margaret's sons, effectively removing her from any influence over her own children. Margaret fled to England in 1515, heavily pregnant with Angus's child, seeking protection from her brother Henry VIII. She gave birth to her daughter Margaret Douglas in England and spent the next few years trying to regain influence in Scotland while her marriage to Angus collapsed completely. She sought a divorce, which in the early 1500s required papal approval and was nearly impossible to obtain. The process dragged on for years, during which Margaret lived in a kind of limbo, neither wife nor widow, neither English nor Scottish, neither regent nor mother to her royal son. In 1528, Margaret finally secured her divorce from Angus and immediately married her third husband, Henry Stuart. This marriage was slightly better than the second, but still politically complicated. Her son James V came of age and began ruling in his own right, but his relationship with his mother was strained after years of separation and manipulation by various Scottish factions. Margaret Tudor died on October 18, 1541, at Methven Castle in Scotland. She was 51 years old, which was actually a decent lifespan for the era. She died from what contemporary sources called palsy, probably a stroke or similar condition. She'd outlived 2 husbands, been divorced from a third, lost 5 of her 6 children in infancy or childhood, been regent and then stripped of power, been caught between 2 kingdoms her entire adult life, and never had a moment of actual freedom or choice in her entire existence. But here's the truly ironic part that Margaret never lived to see. Her life of suffering had a purpose, just not the one anyone intended. While her brother Henry VIII would spend the rest of his life desperately trying to produce a male heir, executing wives and breaking from the Catholic Church in the process, Margaret had already done the job. Her son, James V, would have a daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, who would have a son, James VI of Scotland. And when Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I, died childless in 1603, it was Margaret's great-grandson who became James I of England, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England. Margaret Tudor, the girl sold at 13 to secure a peace treaty that barely lasted a decade, became the ancestor of every British monarch who followed. Not her famous brother, Henry VIII, whose desperate quest for heirs destroyed lives and changed England's religion. Margaret, the forgotten sister, the failed political transaction, won in the end. But the cost of that victory would be paid by her female descendants for generations to come. And 500 years later, one of those descendants would be a 19-year-old girl named Diana Spencer, walking toward a wedding that would echo Margaret's trauma in ways that would shock the world. Here's where the story gets really twisted. While Margaret Tudor's legitimate descendants were busy uniting the crowns of Scotland and England, another branch of the royal family tree was growing in the shadows. A branch that would eventually merge with the Spencer family and deposit all that royal trauma directly into Diana's bloodline. We're talking about the bastards. King Charles II, who reigned from 1660 to 1685, had a problem that was the exact opposite of his ancestor Henry VIII. Charles was perfectly capable of producing children. He produced at least 12 acknowledged illegitimate children by various mistresses, and probably several more that weren't officially recognized. What he couldn't do was produce a single legitimate heir with his wife, Catherine of Braganza. Not one. Despite decades of marriage, Catherine remained childless. But Charles II wasn't about to let his numerous illegitimate children suffer for the circumstances of their birth. He legitimized them through titles and lands, creating a whole generation of royal bastards who married into the highest levels of English aristocracy. These weren't secret shame children hidden away. These were dukes and duchesses, politically powerful and socially accepted, carrying royal Stuart blood, even if they couldn't inherit the throne. Henry Fitzroy, 1st Duke of Grafton, was born in 1663 to Charles II and his mistress Barbara Villiers. Charles Lennox, 1st Duke of Richmond, was born in 1672 to Charles II and Louise de Keroualle. Both of these men became powerful nobles, married well-connected aristocratic women, and their descendants spread through the English nobility like royal DNA wildfire. The Spencer family, already well-established aristocrats, married into these lines multiple times over the generations. Diana's paternal ancestor, the 4th Earl Spencer, married Adelaide Seymour, who descended from Henry Fitzroy through multiple generational links. Through other Spencer marriages, Diana also descended from Charles Lennox's line. She had Charles II's blood coming at her from multiple directions in her family tree. But wait, it gets more complicated. Charles II's brother, James II, also had illegitimate children who entered the aristocracy. Henrietta Fitzjames, daughter of James II, and Arabella Churchill, married Henry Waldegrave, and their descendants also married into the Spencer line. So Diana didn't just carry the blood of one Stuart king's bastards, she carried it from two different kings through multiple different maternal lines, all concentrated into one family. Now here's what historians don't often emphasize. These royal bastards carried more than just DNA. They carried the expectations, the pressure, and the systematic abuse that came with being royal adjacent. They were raised with the knowledge that they were almost royalty, that they carried sacred bloodlines, but they could never quite reach the throne themselves. Their purpose was to marry strategically, produce heirs, and maintain the complex web of aristocratic power that kept the British class system running. The women in these lines had it particularly rough. They were valuable breeding stock because of their royal blood, which meant their marriages were arranged as carefully as if they were actual princesses. They faced the same pressure to produce male heirs, the same scrutiny of their fertility, the same political calculations that had destroyed Margaret Tudor centuries earlier. Royal blood, even illegitimate royal blood, came with a price tag attached to your womb. By the time we reached the 20th century, the Spencer family had accumulated so much royal blood from so many different sources that they were essentially more royal than the actual royal family. The Windsors, remember, were German imports. The Spencers were the real English aristocracy, carrying the DNA of the Tudors, the Stuarts, and even earlier medieval dynasties. But here's the dark reality that nobody wanted to acknowledge. All that accumulated royal blood meant accumulated generational trauma. Every woman in that bloodline had been treated as a transaction. Every marriage had been arranged for political or financial benefit. Every pregnancy had been scrutinized for its potential to produce male heirs. The Spencer family didn't just inherit wealth and titles. They inherited a system of abuse that had been perfecting itself for centuries. And that system was still operating in the mid-20th century, still grinding up women and spitting them out, still treating female bodies as national resources rather than human beings. Which brings us to Diana's mother, Frances Roche, and the horror show that was her marriage to John Spencer. Because if you think arranged marriages and fertility pressure were things of the distant past, you're about to discover just how wrong you are. The Tudor system of treating women as breeding animals didn't end with the Tudors. It just got better at hiding behind the veneer of modern respectability. Frances Ruth Burke Roche was born in 1936, the daughter of Maurice Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy, and Ruth Gill. Her mother Ruth was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, which meant Frances grew up in the immediate orbit of the royal family. She wasn't royal herself, but she was close enough to understand how the system worked. Close enough to know what was expected of aristocratic women. Close enough to know that her value would be measured primarily by her ability to produce the right kind of children. In 1954, when Frances was just 18 years old, she married John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, who would later become the 8th Earl Spencer. On the surface, this looked like a good match. Both families were aristocratic, both had royal connections, both understood the rules of their social class. But underneath the respectable exterior, this was an arranged marriage in all but name. The families approved. The connection made political and social sense. Whether Frances and John actually loved each other was, at best, a secondary consideration. What happened next is documented by Diana's younger brother, Charles Spencer, who would later describe the experience as traumatic for everyone involved. Frances got pregnant almost immediately after the wedding, which was expected and celebrated. She gave birth to a daughter, Sarah, in 1955, then another daughter, Jane, in 1957. And this is where the nightmare begins. In aristocratic families, particularly families as connected to the royal bloodline as the Spencers, having daughters was fine, But not having sons was a catastrophe. The title Earl Spencer could only pass through male heirs. Without a son, the earldom would go to a distant male relative, and the family's accumulated wealth and property could be dispersed. John Spencer needed a son, not wanted one, needed one, and Francis's job was to provide that son. In January 1960, Francis gave birth to a son they named John. The celebration lasted approximately 10 hours, which is how long baby John survived before dying. The cause of death isn't fully documented in public records, but infant mortality from genetic issues or birth complications was still relatively common in 1960, particularly in families with as much inbreeding in their ancestry as the Spencers had. The death of baby John was devastating, but the response from the Spencer family was even worse. Instead of allowing Francis time to grieve, instead of providing support, the pressure intensified. She'd proven she could have a son, which meant she needed to immediately get pregnant again and try for another one. Diana's brother Charles would later describe this period as a dreadful time for my parents and probably the root of their divorce because I don't think they ever got over it. Here's where it gets truly horrific, in a way that directly echoes what happened to Catherine of Aragon and other Tudor wives. Francis was sent to clinics on Harley Street in London, the most expensive and prestigious medical district in Britain, to undergo testing to determine what was wrong with her. Charles Spencer described the experience as humiliating, which is probably an understatement. Think about what this means. A woman who'd just lost a baby, who was grieving and traumatized, was subjected to medical examinations designed to find out why she couldn't properly perform her function as an aristocratic womb. Never mind that infant death was sometimes just a tragic reality of biology. Never mind that John Spencer's genetic contribution was equally responsible. The burden of blame fell entirely on Francis, just as it had fallen on royal wives for centuries. The examinations found nothing wrong because there probably wasn't anything wrong. Infant mortality was declining in 1960 but still happened, particularly in families with complex genetic histories. But the tests served their real purpose. They reminded Francis that her job was to produce a healthy son, and until she did, she was failing. On July 1st, 1961, Francis gave birth to another child, a girl. They named her Diana Frances Spencer. According to historical accounts, the family was so convinced the baby would be a boy that they hadn't even chosen a girl's name. It took them a week to settle on Diana, after a distant relative who'd been known as Lady Diana Spencer before her marriage. The disappointment was palpable. Another daughter, still no heir. Diana grew up knowing, even as a small child, that she'd been a disappointment from birth, that she was supposed to have been a boy, that her existence was, in some fundamental way, not what her family had wanted or needed. This wasn't paranoia or imagination. Charles Spencer himself has confirmed that the pressure for a male heir was intense, and that Diana was aware of it. In 1964, Francis finally produced what the Spencer family needed, a healthy son, Charles Spencer. The relief must have been overwhelming. The succession was secure. John Spencer had his heir. Francis had fulfilled her biological obligation to the family line. But by then, the damage to the marriage was irreparable. The years of pressure, the humiliating medical tests, the death of baby John, the implicit message that Francis's worth was measured entirely by her reproductive success, had poisoned the relationship. Charles Spencer later said the trauma of losing baby John and the subsequent pressure was probably the root of their divorce. By 1967, Francis had fallen in love with Peter Shand Kidd, a wallpaper heir who represented something John Spencer never did, the possibility of being valued for something other than her uterus. Francis left John Spencer in 1967, moving in with Peter Shand Kidd and effectively abandoning her 4 children. The divorce that followed was brutal and public. John Spencer sued for custody and won, which was unusual at the time. Courts generally favored mothers in custody battles, but John had advantages. He was an earl, wealthy, connected, and Francis had committed the unforgivable sin of adultery by leaving him for another man. Diana was 6 years old when her mother left. She later described hearing the crunch of gravel as her mother's car drove away, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The children were raised primarily by their father at the family estate, Althorpe, though they had minimal contact with Francis in the years immediately following the divorce. Here's what nobody wanted to say out loud. Francis Roche's experience in the 1950s and 1960s was a direct continuation of the Tudor system. She'd been married young to secure an alliance between aristocratic families. She'd been pressured to produce male heirs. She'd been subjected to humiliating medical examinations when she failed to perform her reproductive function properly. She'd been blamed for circumstances beyond her control. And when she finally tried to escape, she lost her children. The exact same patterns that had destroyed Margaret Tudor, Catherine of Aragon, and Anne Boleyn were still operating in mid-20th century Britain. They'd just gotten better at disguising themselves as respectable upper-class behavior instead of medieval tyranny. The system didn't need executioners and annulments anymore. It had divorce courts and custody battles. And Diana, born into this mess, carrying all that accumulated royal blood and all that accumulated trauma, was being raised to take her place in the same system. Nobody told her the truth about what royal blood really meant. Nobody explained that being descended from kings and queens wasn't a privilege, it was a curse that turned you into property. Nobody prepared her for what would happen when she, like her mother and her grandmother and Margaret Tudor before them, was selected to continue the bloodline. She was just a beautiful young woman from an aristocratic family, supposedly destined for a fairy tale. What she got instead was a front-row seat to 500 years of accumulated horror, all coming due at once. Diana Frances Spencer grew up in Park House, a property on the Royal Sandringham estate, literally in the shadow of the Queen's residence. She grew up knowing she was supposed to have been a boy. She grew up watching her mother's car drive away. She grew up being groomed, whether she understood it or not, to take her place in a system that had been destroying women with royal blood for over 500 years. But Diana had something her ancestors didn't have. She was living in an era with television cameras, tabloid newspapers, and eventually, the ability to tell her own story. The system that had silently consumed Margaret Tudor, Francis Roche, and countless others was about to collide with modern media, and the collision would expose horrors that the British aristocracy had kept hidden for centuries. Diana first met Prince Charles in 1977 when she was 16 years old. The meeting happened at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, during a shooting party. But here's the detail that reveals how the system really worked. Charles wasn't there to meet Diana. He was dating her older sister, Sarah. Diana was just the kid's sister, barely noticed, certainly not considered as a potential bride for the heir to the throne. The relationship between Charles and Sarah didn't last, but it established a connection between the prince and the Spencer family. By 1980, Charles was 31 years old and facing increasing pressure to marry and produce heirs. The royal family and British public were growing impatient. Charles needed a wife, and she needed to meet very specific criteria: aristocratic bloodline, impeccable reputation, young enough to have children, and most importantly, virginal. In the late 20th century, the British royal family was still requiring that brides for senior royals be virgins. Not because of religious morality, but because of the same paranoid obsession with bloodline purity that had driven Henry VIII to execute wives. They needed to be absolutely certain that any children were actually Charles's biological offspring. A woman with a sexual history represented a threat to the succession, just as Anne Boleyn's alleged adultery had been used to justify her execution 450 years earlier. Diana Spencer, at 19 years old, fit the criteria perfectly. She came from one of the most aristocratic families in England, with more royal blood than Charles himself. She worked as a kindergarten teacher, which gave her a wholesome, nurturing image. She had no serious boyfriends in her past, no scandals, no hint of sexual impropriety. And she was young, which meant plenty of time to produce multiple heirs. She was, by the system's standards, perfect breeding stock. The courtship was brief and heavily supervised. Charles and Diana were rarely alone together. Their dates were public events, surrounded by security and usually involving other people. This wasn't romance. It was an audition. The royal family was evaluating whether Diana could perform the role they needed her to fill, produce heirs, look pretty, stay quiet, and not cause problems. In February 1981, after dating for just 6 months, Charles proposed. Diana was 19 years old. Charles was 32. She said yes, because what else was she going to say? This was Prince Charles, heir to the British throne, and she'd been raised in a world where marrying into the royal family was considered the ultimate achievement for an aristocratic woman. This was supposed to be her fairy tale. The engagement interview, broadcast on television, revealed the first cracks in the fairy tale. When the interviewer asked if they were in love, Diana immediately said, "Of course." Charles's response, "Whatever in love means." That phrase, broadcast to millions, should have been a warning sign. But the wedding machinery was already in motion, and 19-year-old Diana was swept along whether she wanted to be or not. Behind the scenes, Diana was already cracking under the pressure. Her bulimia started before the wedding, triggered by the stress and the constant scrutiny of her body. The media was obsessed with her weight, her dress size, her appearance. Every photograph was analyzed. Every public appearance was critiqued. Diana's body wasn't her own anymore. It belonged to the public, to the media, and most importantly, to the system that needed her to produce heirs. The wedding took place on July 29, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral. An estimated 750 million people worldwide watched on television. It was supposed to be a modern fairy tale, a beautiful young woman marrying a prince. But for Diana, it was a public bedding ceremony, just like the ones that had humiliated Margaret Tudor and countless other royal brides. The entire world was watching her commit to a life she didn't fully understand, binding herself to a man she barely knew, entering a system that had destroyed every woman who'd come before her. Diana got pregnant almost immediately after the wedding, which was exactly what the system demanded. Prince William was born in June 1982, just 11 months after the wedding. Diana had fulfilled her primary function. She'd produced an heir. The pressure should have decreased, but it didn't. Now she needed to produce a spare, just in case something happened to William. Prince Harry was born in September 1984. 2 sons. The succession was secure. Diana's biological value to the royal family was essentially complete. But the personal cost was catastrophic. Diana's bulimia worsened after William's birth. She was suffering from postpartum depression, which in the 1980s was barely acknowledged and certainly not treated seriously in royal circles. Charles, who'd never wanted this marriage in the first place and had maintained his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles throughout, was increasingly distant and critical. Diana later revealed in interviews that she'd felt trapped from almost the beginning. The palace controlled her schedule, her wardrobe, her public statements. She couldn't see friends without permission. She couldn't go shopping alone. She couldn't do anything without layers of security, protocol officers, and royal handlers monitoring her every move. She'd been sold into the system just like Margaret Tudor, just like Frances Roche, just like every woman with royal blood before her. The only difference was that Diana's prison was gilded and broadcast on television. The eating disorder wasn't just about Diana's body image issues. It was one of the few things she could control. Everything else in her life was dictated by the system. When she woke up, what she wore, where she went, what she said, how she smiled. Bulimia gave her control over something, even if that control was self-destructive. It was a scream for help that nobody wanted to hear because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the fairy tale was a lie. By the late 1980s, Diana's marriage was essentially dead. She and Charles were living separate lives, maintaining appearances for the media but barely speaking in private. Diana began to understand something that Margaret Tudor had learned 500 years earlier. Royal marriage wasn't about love or partnership. It was about producing heirs and maintaining the system. Once you'd served that purpose, you were disposable. But Diana had something Margaret Tudor never had: media access. And in the 1990s, she started to use it. She gave interviews. She talked about her bulimia, her depression, her failed marriage. She pulled back the curtain on the royal family and showed the British public what life was really like for women trapped in the system. The revelations were shocking, not because they were new, but because finally someone was saying them out loud. The most famous interview came in 1995 when Diana spoke to BBC's Panorama programme. She talked about Charles's affair with Camilla. She talked about the pressure she'd faced. She questioned whether Charles should even become king. It was an unprecedented act of defiance, a royal bride speaking her truth instead of maintaining the silence that had protected the system for centuries. The phrase Diana used, "There were three of us in this marriage," became iconic. She was exposing the lie that royal marriages were about love instead of duty. The royal family was furious. Queen Elizabeth reportedly wrote to both Charles and Diana, essentially ordering them to divorce. The divorce was finalized in August 1996. Diana lost her title of Her Royal Highness, but kept her apartment in Kensington Palace and continued her charity work. She was free of the marriage, but not free of the system. She was still the mother of the heir to the throne. She was still monitored, still photographed, still trapped. And then, on August 31st, 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris. She was 36 years old, dating Dodi Al-Fayed, being pursued by paparazzi photographers through a tunnel at high speed. The driver was later found to be 3 times over the legal alcohol limit. Diana, who'd spent her entire adult life being hunted by cameras, died while trying to escape them. The conspiracy theories started immediately and have never stopped. But here's the simple truth. Diana didn't need to be murdered by some elaborate plot. The system killed her just as surely as it had killed Margaret Tudor, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Francis Roche's spirit. The constant pressure, the media obsession, the lack of privacy, the treatment of her body as public property, the reduction of her worth to her fertility, all of it was violence. All of it was abuse. All of it was the same system that had been grinding up women with royal blood for over 500 years. Diana died young, like so many royal women before her. But unlike them, she'd managed to tell her story while she was still alive. She'd exposed the system. She'd shown the world what royal blood really cost, and that exposure would change everything for the next generation. Here's where the story gets its final grotesque twist. Margaret Tudor spent her entire life being used by men who valued her only for her political and reproductive utility. She died at 52, having outlived 2 husbands, divorced a third, lost 5 children in infancy, been regent and then stripped of power, and never had a single moment of genuine freedom. But her great-grandson became James I of England, uniting the crowns and ensuring that her bloodline, not her brother Henry VIII's, would rule Britain forever. Diana Spencer carried that same bloodline, concentrated through centuries of aristocratic intermarriage and reinforced by the bastard lines of Charles II and James II. She married at 19, produced 2 heirs, suffered through bulimia and depression, endured a failed marriage broadcast to the world, and died at 36. The parallels are almost unbearable. The system treated her exactly the same way it had treated Margaret Tudor nearly 500 years earlier. But Diana did something Margaret Tudor couldn't do. She broke the silence. Through her interviews, her public work, her willingness to show vulnerability, Diana exposed the royal system for what it really was. She showed that being a princess wasn't a fairy tale. It was a gilded cage. She revealed that royal marriages weren't about love, they were about bloodlines and heirs. She proved that women with royal blood were still being treated as breeding stock, just with better public relations. And here's where Margaret Tudor's 500-year revenge finally pays off. Diana's sons, William and Harry, both inherited her bloodline and her awareness. William, the future king, will be the first British monarch ever to descend from Charles II. He'll be the first descendant of Charles III to reign since 1714. The Hanover-Windsor line, The German imports who ruled because the actual English royal lines died out will be replaced by genuine Tudor-Stuart blood through Margaret Tudor's descendants. But more importantly, William broke the pattern. In 2011, he married Catherine Middleton, a commoner, not an aristocrat, not someone with carefully vetted bloodlines, not a virgin whose reproductive potential had been medically evaluated. A regular person he'd dated for years, who he actually knew and loved. The wedding was still a massive public spectacle, still involved ridiculous protocol, but the fundamental nature of the transaction had changed. William chose his own wife. For the first time in centuries, a direct heir to the British throne married for love instead of duty.
Harry went even further. He married Meghan Markle, an American actress, a divorced woman, and walked away from the entire royal system. In 2020, Harry and Meghan formally stepped back from royal duties and moved to California. Harry chose freedom over duty, love over bloodline, personal happiness over the system that had killed his mother. He explicitly cited the media treatment of Meghan and the lack of support from the royal family as reasons for leaving, directly echoing his mother's complaints about the system.
The curse that started with Margaret Tudor, that destroyed Francis Roche's marriage, that killed Diana at 36, has finally been broken. Not because the system changed, but because Diana's sons learned from her suffering and chose differently. William chose love while staying in the system. Harry chose love while leaving the system entirely. Both choices would have been impossible for Margaret Tudor, impossible for any royal woman before Diana. The price was staggering. Margaret Tudor suffered through 3 marriages and lost 5 children. Francis Roche was humiliated by medical tests and lost custody of her children. Diana suffered through bulimia, depression, a failed marriage, and died being chased by photographers. Generations of women with royal blood were treated as property, as breeding animals, as disposable tools of the state, but the bloodline survived. Margaret Tudor's descendants rule Britain, not Henry VIII's. The woman who was sold at 13 to secure a peace treaty that barely lasted a decade ultimately won the Game of Thrones. Her blood flows through every British monarch since 1603, and it will continue to flow through every monarch to come. Diana's blood, carrying all that accumulated Tudor-Stuart DNA and all that accumulated trauma, produced 2 sons who finally broke free of the system that had enslaved their female ancestors for centuries. William will be king, but he chose his own queen. Harry chose freedom over a throne. Both choices were bought with the suffering of every woman who came before them. The most grotesque part, the system is still there. The British royal family still exists, still operates on many of the same principles, still treats its members as public property. But the specific curse of arranged marriages for breeding purposes, the reduction of women to their reproductive capacity, the treatment of royal blood as more important than human happiness, that particular horror finally ended with Diana's generation. Margaret Tudor would probably laugh if she could see it. She was sold to Scotland at 13, widowed at 23, betrayed by everyone she trusted, and died in exile from her own son's court. But 500 years later, her bloodline conquered the throne, and her descendants' suffering finally freed future generations from the same fate. Henry VIII, who executed wives and broke from the Catholic Church trying to secure his bloodline, left no descendants on the throne. Margaret, the failed political transaction, the forgotten sister, won everything. Diana paid for that victory with her life. She was the last woman who had to be sacrificed to the system. Her sons learned from her suffering and chose differently. The Tudor curse of treating royal women as property died with Diana in that Paris tunnel. It took 500 years, countless destroyed lives, and one princess who was brave enough to tell the truth. But it's finally over. The blood running through Diana's veins came from Tudor horror, Margaret Tudor's arranged marriage at 13, Charles II's desperate production of illegitimate heirs, James II's continuing of that pattern, Francis Roche's humiliation in fertility clinics. All of it accumulated in Diana, and all of it destroyed her. But her destruction freed her sons, and through them, it freed every royal woman who will come after. That's the real legacy of royal blood, not crowns and palaces and fairy tales. Trauma, abuse, and systematic dehumanization passed down through generations until finally one woman was brave enough to say the truth out loud, and her sons were brave enough to choose differently. Margaret Tudor's revenge took 500 years to complete, but it was worth the wait.